The grand banquet hall of Zenith Point fell utterly still. Commander Elias Thorne slowly placed his silver utensils across the edge of his crystal plate. He folded his linen napkin with terrifying, deliberate care, pushed back his heavy chair, and stood up to abandon the assembly without uttering a single word. What happens when the youngest species in the galaxy decides they no longer need permission to exist? Subscribe to hear the rest of the story, because the silence that followed changed the universe forever. The data stylus in Varon's long, multi-jointed fingers had been perfectly balanced just 3 cycles prior, when the Terran delegation first dragged their heavy boots across the polished floors of the High Council chamber. Varon, senior advisor to the Athelian Dominion, had studied the Terran biological profiles in exhaustive detail. Humans lived a fraction of an Athelian's lifespan. They were frantic, hurried creatures, driven by the ticking clock of their own cellular decay. When Commander Thorne and Major Vance had presented Terra Prime's entry proposals to the High Council, Varon stood silent, his secondary eyes tracking the subtle micro-expressions on the humans' faces. Thorne's jaw had tightened, the muscles in his forearms corded beneath the fabric of his dark uniform. Yet he didn't beg. He stood before Princess Kaelin and offered trade routes and defensive pacts as if his young, dust-covered world were already an equal to the Zenith Citadel. Kaelin, draped in the silken authority of a centuries-long reign, had barely glanced at the holographic data. She dismissed the proposals with a dismissive flick of her luminescent wrist, citing the Terran's short, violent history. She dictated a highly restricted, subordinate role for Terra Prime, expecting the humans to bow their heads in gratitude for the scraps. Varon had watched Thorne's chest rise and fall. One slow, heavily controlled breath. They called humanity a spark that would burn out. Instead, it ignited a revolution. Varon would not understand the terrifying weight of that truth until much later. At the time, he only saw a lesser being struggling to accept its assigned place in the hierarchy. The evening before the formal banquet, Varon entered the Terran delegation's assigned quarters to dictate the ceremonial protocols. He found Thorne sitting alone by the curved viewing window, staring out at the unfamiliar starfield. On the low metal table beside him sat a decorative crystal plate holding the traditional Athelian welcome ration. It remained entirely untouched, a cold, geometric symbol of his absolute isolation within a structure built to make him feel small. To understand the arrogance of an empire, you have to watch it fall from the inside. Subscribe to uncover how one man's quiet dignity shattered a dynasty. Thorne didn't look away from the stars when Varon recited the schedule. The human simply offered a sharp, single nod. Varon found the lack of deference irritating, an offensive friction against Athelian custom. To his people, respect isn't given by the ancient. It is earned by the brief. And these brief, fragile creatures had earned nothing but the right to listen. The banquet the following evening was an overwhelming display of Dominion wealth. 300 species packed into the tiered observation and dining rings. The air smelled of exotic spices and the charged hum of the translation matrix. Varon stood at Kaelin's right hand, monitoring the subtle shifts in power among the vassal states as they dined. Then the princess made her move. Perhaps she was annoyed by Thorne's unbending posture at the lower tables. Perhaps she simply wished to entertain the gathered assembly of loyalists. Kaelin raised her voice, letting the hall's acoustics carry her condescension to every corner. She mocked the Terran lifespan, comparing their frantic technological expansion to the uncoordinated thrashing of a newborn. She labeled his species reckless infants, utterly unworthy of the high tables they sought to join. Major Vance, seated next to Thorne, went rigid. Varon watched her hand twitch toward her hip, a reflexive reach for a weapon she had surrendered at the airlock. The hostility radiating from her was palpable, hot and sharp, but Thorne simply shifted his weight. He didn't look at Vance, but the microscopic tilt of his head was enough. The Major froze, her anger trapped in her throat. The air in the grand hall grew thick. The scent of roasted Vexian meats and sweet nectar seemed to sour as Kaelin's insult hung in the space above the tables. The princess smiled, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with the satisfaction of a flawless execution. She had put the upstarts in their place. She had reminded the galaxy who held the reins. Laughter rippled through the alien delegations. It was a cruel, sycophantic sound, ringing off the polished stone walls. Varan locked his primary eyes on Thorn. He expected the human to flush with color. He expected a shouting match, a desperate defense, a frantic plea for validation. He expected the crude, messy, emotional outburst of a lesser species. 1,000 years of empire, undone by a single moment of silence. Thorn didn't raise his eyes to the dais. He didn't speak. He simply stopped eating. Varan's secondary eyelids flickered. He anticipated the human's rage. He braced for the predictable escalation of a lesser species demanding the respect they had not yet secured. The hall held its collective breath, waiting for the outburst that would justify Kalen's crushing sanctions. The Athelian guards along the perimeter instinctively rested their hands on their pulse rifles. Instead, the Terran commander moved with a terrifying, absolute calm. And as the heavy acoustic doors sealed shut behind the departing Terrans, the true devastation of that silence settled over the room. He didn't start a war with weapons, he started one by walking away. Varan watched, entirely paralyzed, as the unthinkable occurred. The Vexian emissary, a creature of pure calculating logic who had suffered under Dominion taxation for 3 centuries, slowly pushed back his chair. He did not speak to Princess Kalen. He did not ask for permission. He simply followed the path the humans had carved toward the exit. Then the Ilari delegation rose, their silken garments rustling loudly in the dead quiet. Then the heavy, plated boots of the Morith general sounded on the stone floor. A chain reaction of quiet, devastating defiance tore through the grand hall. Dozens of vassal states, inspired by the unwavering dignity of a species Kalen, had just called an infant, abandoned their tables. Treaties meticulously maintained for generations dissolved in the span of 4 minutes. The Athelian dominion did not fall to a massive armada. It cracked because one man refused to surrender his self-worth to an empire's hubris. Emperor Silvatha's fury the next morning was a physical weight in the High Council chamber. He dismissed Kalen's desperate protests with a harsh wave of his hand, his ancient face tight with the realization of their catastrophic miscalculation. Varan stepped forward and activated the central holographic projector. He brought up the heavily redacted files he had finally managed to decrypt from the Terran network. He displayed Commander Thorn's extensive military and humanitarian record. The glowing data feeds filled the air, detailing a mortal who had navigated solar flares, commanded evacuation fleets, and brokered peace between warring factions on a dozen hostile frontier worlds. Their short lifespans drove a fierce, unyielding urgency. This was not a child playing at galactic politics. This was a titan who had simply chosen to wear the quiet clothes of a diplomat. It took 3 weeks for Kalen to truly understand the depth of her failure. When she finally traveled incognito to Terra Prime, Varan walked 3 paces behind her, his imperial robes concealed beneath a heavy, unremarkable traveler's cloak. The gravity of the human world was heavy, the air thick with moisture and the unfamiliar scent of heated machinery. Varan observed the humans in their natural environment, hurried, brilliant, building the future with a desperate speed. They located Thorn in a civilian cafe in the heart of sprawling Nova City. He wore plain fabric clothes, his posture relaxed as he read from a digital pad. Kalen approached his table. Varan hung back near the open doorway, watching the princess of the Athelian dominion lower her head to a species she had mocked. Her voice was a low tremor, stripped entirely of its imperial resonance. She admitted her blindness. She asked the human, plainly and without condition, to teach her how to govern with the respect she had failed to show. Thorn studied her for a long, heavy moment. Varan noted the subtle softening of the muscles around the commander's eyes. The human didn't gloat. He didn't demand a public retraction. He simply nodded, stood, and walked to the vendor's counter. When Thorn returned, he set down a small, circular ceramic plate between them. On it rested a warm, local pastry, the sweet scent of spun sugar rising into the damp air. It was a simple, fragile object, sliding across the worn metal table to bridge the vast, quiet space between an ancient empire and the brief, bright spark that would lead them into a new era. What happens when the oldest empire in the universe finally learns how to listen? Subscribe to find out in tomorrow's story.